My name is Callum Archibald Strath, and I am writing this from Edinburgh in the winter of 1901, 30 years after I last set foot in the territory of Montana, 30 years after I walked down a mountain, carrying nothing but my tools and the clothes on my back, and the memory of a cold that has never fully left my hands. I am writing to you, James, because you are the only living person I trust with the truth of it, and because I have carried this account alone long enough that the weight of it has begun to feel dangerous. Not dangerous to me. I am 63, and my health is not good, and I do not expect to be imperiled by anything further in this life. Dangerous to others. Men with ambition and no fear of what they do not understand. Men who go looking in mountains. I need you to read every word of this. I need you to understand not what I think happened, but what I know happened, because I was there, and I have had 30 years to consider it from every angle a rational mind can approach, and I have arrived, always, at the same conclusion. When I am done, you will understand why I am asking you to destroy this letter, and I will ask you to make your own decision about whether you can honor that request. I will tell you now that I believe you should burn it. I will also tell you that I understand if you cannot. I was 41 years old in the autumn of 1871, and I had spent 15 years working survey and prospecting work across the Western Territories, from the Colorado placer fields north, through Wyoming and into Montana Territory, after the gold rushes of the middle 60s had opened the drainage work up. I had served the Army as a junior surveyor before that, under Colonel Reynolds, mapping tributary systems that later became the basis for the territorial survey maps. I say this not to establish my credentials in any formal sense, but to establish that I was not a man who imagined things. I had surveyed the Bitterroot Valley approaches twice before that autumn. I had drawn maps of the mountain drainages that men use to file their claims. I knew that country in the way a working man knows it, by elevation, by water volume, by the behavior of the ground when the frost begins to work into it in late September. I am telling you what I saw. The outfit that autumn was 4 men. Myself, working the drainage as the senior prospector, and the man who had scouted the tributary access the previous spring. Thomas Healy, an Irish miner out of Butte, who had worked placer operations for 6 years, and had a gift for reading water that I have never seen matched. A younger man named Ord, 24, whose family name I never learned and never asked for, which was common enough among the men who came west to leave other lives behind. And Luther Webb, a Georgian by birth who had come west after the war, and who I will say plainly was a difficult man, quick-tempered, acquisitive, and not much given to consulting anyone else before he acted. Luther was a capable miner. He was also the source of nearly every problem that followed. We were working a secondary tributary of one of the eastern Bitterroot drainages, a small and cold creek that ran out of a narrow defile about 4 miles above where it joined the main channel. I will not give you the name of the creek or the precise drainage. That is deliberate, and I will explain why at the end. Suffice to say it was high country, above 6,000 feet, in a valley so narrow that direct sun reached the creek bed for less than 4 hours a day by early October. The placer color we had found there in late September was good enough to justify the dig work required to expose the ancient channel gravels, and we had spent the first week of October diverting the stream flow 30 feet south to open the original stream bed for sluicing. The diversion work was Thomas's idea, and it was good work, done with the careful judgment he always brought to water. We built a timber and sod check dam 2 feet high and let the stream find the lower ground to the south naturally, which it did over the course of 2 days. What the original stream bed contained when we exposed it I will come to in a moment. But I want you to understand first what that valley felt like in October, before any of this, because the physical sensation of the place is central to what I am about to tell you, and I find I cannot separate the cold that came later from the cold that was simply there. October in the high Bitterroot drainage is a specific kind of cold, not the dramatic cold of genuine winter, not the cold that kills stock and freezes the creek solid, but a persistent, seeping cold that comes up through the ground and sits in the low air all day regardless of the sun. The creek ran at perhaps 38 degrees by mid-October, cold enough to ache the hands through leather gloves after 5 minutes in the water. The ground held frost in the shadows from before dawn until past 2 in the afternoon. When the wind moved through the defile, it moved in a single direction, always down canyon, always steady, and it had a quality I can only describe as pressurized, as though the narrow walls were concentrating it. Working in that valley was working inside a cold that was close and constant, and after 2 weeks, so familiar that you stopped noticing it, the way a man stops hearing a creek he camps beside. I am telling you about that cold because I want you to understand that I knew cold. I knew what it felt like in that specific place, in that specific season. I knew the difference between the cold of exposure and the cold of wet and the cold of elevation. I want you to have that established before I describe what came later, so you understand that when I tell you the cold inside that mountain was something categorically different from anything I had experienced before, I am not speaking from ignorance. I am speaking from 30 years of working in high mountain country. The first thing we uncovered was a flat stone. That sounds ordinary. The drainage gravel was full of stones, and the original stream bed, when we exposed it, was a compressed layer of cobbly gravel cemented by a fine clay that had to be broken with picks before it could be sluiced. We had been breaking into that layer for the better part of a morning when Thomas's pick struck something that rang rather than thudded. He struck it again. Same tone. He scraped the clay off the top of it with his shovel and stood looking at it for a moment without calling out, and it was his silence that made me look over. The stone was granite, which was not unusual. What was unusual was its face. It was flat, in a way that granite in a stream bed is not flat. Dressed is the word. The surface brought to a plane by deliberate tool work, the edges cut to right angles. It was roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, and perhaps 8 inches thick. And when we had cleared enough clay from around it to see that it was not alone, that there were others in sequence behind it, each the same dimension, each fitted to the next with a joint so tight I could not slide a folded paper into it, I understood that we were not looking at a natural feature. We were looking at a staircase, descending into the mountain at an angle of perhaps 30 degrees, heading northwest, away from the original stream channel and into the hillside. The steps were worn at their centers in a smooth concavity, the way flagstones wear under many years of traffic, but the edges remained crisp and clean where the clay had protected them. How many steps there were I cannot tell you with certainty. We cleared 6 before we understood the full angle of descent, and by then it was clear the staircase went much further than our excavation had exposed. Thomas straightened up and looked at me and did not say anything. Ord had come over and was crouching at the edge of the exposed steps, running his finger along the joint between 2 of them. Luther was the last to come, and he stood at the back of the group, with his hands on his hips, and a look on his face that I recognized and that already concerned me. Luther Webb had a specific expression he wore when he was calculating the monetary value of something, and it was distinct from every other expression he had. He was wearing it, looking at those steps. I want to tell you what I said, and what I was thinking, because this is the part I have thought about most often in the 30 years since. I was a surveyor. I had 15 years of working knowledge of the Western Territories, of the drainage patterns, of the geological record of that range. I had catalogued enough indigenous earthworks and pictograph sites to understand the general scale and material tradition of what the various peoples of that region built and had built. I knew what a winter camp looked like. I knew what a burial cairn looked like. I knew what the remains of a seasonal structure looked like when the mountain had worked on it for 50 years. This did not look like any of those things. These steps had been cut from granite that was not native to the immediate hillside. The nearest granite of that specific composition and color, a pale gray with large feldspar inclusions, was, as best I could determine from memory of the survey maps, roughly 4 miles north. Someone had quarried, dressed, and transported stones of roughly 400 pounds each across 4 miles of high mountain terrain, and fitted them into a descending staircase that went into a hillside that, from the outside, looked like every other hillside in that defile. I could not reconcile this with anything I knew. I could not place it within any tradition I was familiar with. That is what I told the others, standing at the top of that staircase in the October wind, and the telling of it did not have the effect I hoped. Ord asked how far it went. Thomas said we ought to clear more steps before we went down. Luther said we had enough light for 3 hours and suggested we stop talking. I said I thought we should consider carefully what we were doing before we descended further, that we did not know who had built this or what relationship it might have to the people who still use this region, and that it might be worth sending to the territorial office before we did anything irreversible. Luther looked at me with an expression that was not quite contempt, but approached it. He said we were in a remote drainage 4 miles from any trail and 6 hours from any settlement, and that whatever was down those steps had been down there for a very long time and would not suffer from waiting 3 more hours, and that we were burning daylight. He went down first. I have thought about that choice many times, whether it would have changed anything if I had physically blocked him, whether the argument that would have followed, and it would have been a real argument, might have cost us the remaining daylight anyway. Whether the damage was already done by the act of exposing the stairs themselves, by breaking the clay seal, by letting air into something that had been sealed for however long it had been sealed, I cannot answer these questions. I can tell you that I followed him down, because I believed that someone with judgment needed to be present for whatever came next, and that leaving Luther Webb to explore something like this alone was not an option I was willing to accept. I want to tell you what I noticed first on those stairs. It was not visual, it was physical. Temperature. Outside, on the surface, the October defile temperature was perhaps 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with the wind adding its specific chill. As I descended the first 3 steps into the exposed portion of the staircase, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, the way temperature drops in a cave, as you go deeper and leave the surface air behind. Suddenly, by the time I had descended 10 steps, and my head was below the level of the surrounding hillside, my breath was fogging in front of my face, in a way it had not been above. By the time I reached the landing at the bottom of the first flight, perhaps 20 steps down, the air was cold enough that the exhaled breath hung and fell, rather than dispersed, a behavior I associated with temperatures well below freezing. I stopped and looked at Luther. He had stopped too. He had his hand out, palm up, and he was looking at the vapor rising from it. I looked behind me at the staircase. Through the opening we had made, I could see daylight at the top, and I could see Ord silhouetted there, peering down at us. The daylight looked entirely normal, no fog at the opening. The vapor curtain was specific to the space below. I took 2 steps back up the staircase, and the cold released. 3 steps up, I was back in the ordinary October air. I went down again, and the cold returned immediately, in the same step, the same invisible threshold, as reliable and sharp as passing through a doorway into a cold room. Only we were not in a room. We were in open stone corridor, roofless for the first 50 feet, the original mountain above us having partially collapsed so that sky was visible in ragged rectangles overhead. The walls were stone, yes, cut from the same pale granite as the steps, but they were not enclosed enough to trap cold air. There was no reason, no physical reason I could then or can now identify for that temperature boundary to exist where it existed. I noted this. I filed it in the part of my mind that files anomalies during working hours, because I was also looking at the corridor itself, and the corridor was demanding most of my attention. The walls rose to roughly 12 feet at their highest remaining points. The interior face of each wall was not rough-cut, but dressed to a plainer surface than even the stairs. And along this surface, at shoulder height, ran a continuous horizontal channel, roughly 3 inches wide and 2 inches deep, cut into the stone at perfect regularity for the entire length of the corridor we could see. I recognized these channels. I had seen similar work in illustrations of old-world stone buildings, gutters designed to hold oil or fat, to support a continuous flame running the length of the corridor, torchways. Whoever built this had built it to be seen by firelight. Below the gutterway, at irregular intervals, were carved panels, not pictographs in the way I understood pictographs, not the red ochre handprints and animal figures of the plains or the incised spirals of the southwest. These were geometric in a way that felt intentional and complex, a repeating system of interlocked angular forms that gave the impression, and I know this will sound disordered, of a written language rather than decorative imagery. The regularity, the way the forms repeated and combined and varied in patterns that seemed too structured for pure ornament, suggested to me the possibility of a system, a record, something meant to be read. Luther was not looking at the carvings. Luther had his belt knife out and was prying at the edge of a carved panel that was set into the wall as a separate piece, a rectangular slab seated in a recess rather than carved from the wall itself, and he was prying it. I told him to stop. I told him that clearly and without qualification. He said he wanted to see how deep the recess went and what was behind the slab. I told him the slab was in place and had been in place for reasons we did not understand, and that removing it without documentation was the act of a vandal, not a miner. He gave me a look that I have no interest in describing further and went back to his knife. Thomas had come down by then, and Ord behind him. Thomas came and stood beside me and looked at the corridor with an expression of careful, controlled recognition, the face of a man absorbing something large without allowing himself to react to its full size. Ord went to the carved panels and began tracing the geometric forms with his fingertip, quietly, as though he were reading. Luther's slab came free with a sound like a cork drawn from a bottle, a soft, pressurized exhale that moved the air in the corridor visibly. The slab was about 18 inches by 12, perhaps 2 inches thick, cut from a darker stone than the walls, a fine-grained basalt, and its face was carved with a single repeating glyph that covered the entire surface in a close grid, edge to edge, every instance of the glyph identical, cut to a depth and precision that would have required a controlled tool and significant time. Luther held it up in the fading light, turned it over, examined the back, which was smooth and uncarved, and put it in his pack. I watched him do this. I want you to know that I watched him do it and I did not stop him at that moment, and that failure is one of the things I carry. I was still processing the scale of what we were inside. I was still arriving at the full understanding of what those uniform steps and those torch gutters and those carved panels represented, and in the time it took me to complete that arrival, Luther had packed the tablet and was already moving deeper into the corridor. We went down a second flight of stairs that afternoon. This flight was intact, fully covered by the mountain above, with no sky gaps, and the cold on it was worse. Not gradually worse, but immediately, sharply worse at the landing. My hands were aching by the third step of the second flight, and this was through gloves, thick working gloves that I had worn in genuine Rocky Mountain winter. The vapor from my breath was not hanging and falling now, but crystallizing faintly on the stone walls closest to my face, where I passed near them, a thin bloom of frost that appeared and faded. I have never, before or since, experienced that particular cold below ground, in a structure, without an obvious mechanical explanation for it. Thomas put his hand flat on the wall of the second-level corridor. He held it there for a moment, then lifted it and looked at his palm. He said nothing. I asked what he had felt. He said the wall was not cold. He said the stone itself was not cold. He said the air was cold, only the air, and he had been trying to determine whether the stone was drawing heat from the air, or whether the air was cold independent of the stone, and he believed it was the latter, and that he could not explain it. I could not explain it either. What I will tell you is what the second level looked like, because I believe what it looked like is relevant to what happened afterward, and because no one else who saw it is likely to write it down. The second level opened into a space that I can only describe as a plaza, though that word implies outdoor construction, and this was underground, enclosed by walls on 3 sides, and by the descending mountain overhead, with a partial gap in the ceiling, some 50 feet overhead, through which late afternoon light fell in a single column onto the center of the space. The plaza was perhaps 60 feet across and 80 feet long, its floor fitted with the same dressed stone as the stairs, and at its far end, facing the single entrance through which we had come, was the figure. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I have spent 30 years being careful about it, and I know how such descriptions read, and I know that most men who read them conclude that the witness was exaggerating, was affected by the cold and the strangeness of the situation, was projecting human intention onto a carved rock. I am telling you what I saw. The figure was seated. It was perhaps 8 feet in height in its seated position, which suggested something significantly taller if it had been standing, and it was carved from a single block of stone that was not the same granite as the rest of the construction, but a darker, denser material, shot through with veins of something metallic that caught the column of light and scattered it in ways that made the figure seem to shift when you were not looking directly at it. The posture was deliberate, legs folded, hands resting on the knees, face forward. The face was not human, it was not animal. It occupied a territory between those two descriptions that I do not have vocabulary to navigate precisely. The features were correct in their general arrangement, in the sense that there were features arranged in the correct order, eyes above, nose above mouth, but the proportions and the forms of each were wrong in ways that felt purposeful rather than technically deficient. This was not a carver who could not render a human face. This was a carver rendering something that was not a human face and wanted to be precise about the distinction. It was facing the entrance. Whatever else one might say about it, whatever category one might attempt to place it in, it was facing the entrance with the particular quality of attention that only living things maintain. A forward-directed, specific orientation that you feel rather than see. I have sat in rooms with paintings of faces, and I have not felt it from them. I felt it from this. Luther looked at the figure and then looked at the carved walls of the plaza and took out his knife again. Thomas put his hand on Luther's arm and said they were losing the light. We went back up. That night I will describe through what I could measure and confirm, because I want you to take this letter seriously, and I cannot afford to fill it with impressions when I have facts. We had camped at the entrance to the defile, roughly 100 yards from the exposed staircase, where the valley widened enough to stake the mule and lay bedrolls with some shelter from the canyon wind. The mule, a large Missouri gray named without ceremony as the Gray, was staked to a pine with a 15-foot line and had feed and water and had been, as of the hour before dark, calm and eating. I checked him myself at dusk, because the Gray's temperament was a reliable index of the ambient situation in my experience, and he was unremarkable, ears neutral, feed consumed, no agitation in the feet. At some point in the night, the temperature inside my bedroll dropped enough to wake me. Not the external air temperature, which I noted was consistent with a normal October night in that elevation, approximately 28 degrees, a temperature I had slept in many times. The cold was inside the bedroll, around my hands and face, which were the exposed portions. It was the same quality of cold I had felt in the corridor, not ambient, not wind-driven. Pressurized was the word I used in my own mind then, and it is still the right word. A cold that had mass, that pressed against the skin rather than flowing around it. I sat up. The camp was quiet. Thomas was asleep across the fire from me, which had burned down to coals. Ord was asleep. Luther was asleep, with the pack containing the basalt tablet pushed under his bedroll, which I had noticed before dark and had not addressed. I looked at the fire coals for a long moment, then went back to sleep. That was a mistake in judgment on my part, and I will own it. The morning of the second day was when I noticed what Luther had done. He had gotten up before the rest of us, before full light, and gone back to the staircase. I found this out when Thomas woke me at dawn and pointed at Luther's empty bedroll, and when we found him back at the entrance to the stone structure, he had a length of rope and was working on a carved threshold stone at the top of the second-level staircase, a stone I had noted the night before as being particularly well preserved, its carved surface intact and its coloring distinct from the surrounding material. He had his rope around it and a piece of timber for a lever, and was trying to work it free. I said to him, clearly and directly and with no ambiguity about my meaning, that he was going to stop. He said, "There's a market in San Francisco for pieces like this, and I intend to know how much." Thomas said nothing. Awed was looking at me. I told Luther that I had seen what the territorial government did to men who stripped documented sites of material, which was not in fact much, but that I was prepared to report the location of this structure to the Territorial Survey Office when we returned to the settlement, and that doing so would mean that anything removed from the structure would be traceable to us, and that he might want to consider whether a piece of carved stone was worth that. This was partly a bluff and partly genuine, and Luther was smart enough to read some of both in my voice, and he stood up and left the threshold stone in place. But he did not take the pack off his back, and the pack still held the basalt tablet. That was the negotiation I managed on the second morning. I am not proud of how little it was. We descended again, all four of us, and this time we went further. On the second day, I want to tell you about the cold more carefully, because the second day is when I began to keep deliberate track of it, and to understand that it was not behaving like cold in any of the ways I could account for. The temperature boundary, the threshold I had noticed on the first day at the base of the first flight of stairs, was in the same position on the second morning. I tested it by stepping back and forward across it repeatedly, and each time the transition was immediate, the same step, the same specific location in the corridor. This was not a gradual change. It was a wall of temperature, with no intermediate gradient. On one side, normal October air. On the other, something significantly below freezing. But here is what I noticed that I had not thought to test on the first day. I went back out to the surface and stood in the same temperature, the same 40-odd degrees, same wind, same open air, and breathed, no vapor. I went back down to the base of the first flight and breathed. Heavy vapor, hanging and falling. I went back out, no vapor. This confirmed that the cold was specific to the structure's interior. But then I walked to where the roof gap was open, where the second and third sections of the corridor had no ceiling, and the sky was directly above, and I breathed there. No vapor. The cold was not simply below ground. It was specifically in the enclosed sections. Where the corridor was roofed or the mountain covered it, the cold was present. Where the gaps in the ceiling opened the space to the sky, even partially, the cold was absent or much reduced. The open plaza at the second level, where the figure sat, had that single large ceiling gap, and in the column of light beneath it, the air was noticeably less cold than in the sealed sections on either side. I told Thomas this. I laid it out precisely, the observations, the tests, the pattern. He listened to every word of it, and then stood quietly for a moment with his hands at his sides. He said he did not know what to make of it. I told him I did not either. I told him it was the kind of pattern you observed in a mechanical system, a ventilation system, or a bellows arrangement, except that no such system was visible, and the direction of the effect made no mechanical sense. I told him that whatever it was, it felt to me like something designed, not accidental, designed. Thomas said that we should go back up. I said I thought we should. We did not go back up. Luther was already at the second level, already in the plaza, and Ord had followed him. And by the time Thomas and I reached the top of the second flight and called down into the plaza, Luther was examining the figure from close range, walking around it with his hands out but not quite touching, and Ord was standing at one of the carved wall panels with a small notebook he had produced from somewhere, copying the geometric forms by hand in pencil. I want to tell you about Ord for a moment, because his presence in this account has a specific purpose, and I do not want him to be merely background to Luther's larger part in it. Ord was 24 years old, and he had come west from somewhere in the upper Midwest, Ohio or Indiana. I never learned which. He had more schooling than most men in the placer trade, not formal university schooling, but the kind that comes from an autodidact family that kept books and used them. And he had a habit of thinking carefully before speaking that I associated with men who had been taught that silence was not emptiness. He was not given to talk, but when he talked it was worth hearing. He had a quality of attention that most men his age had not yet grown, a capacity to be completely present in the observation of something without feeling the need to immediately resolve it into a category. He was the one who first said it might be a language. "Not in those words exactly," he said, looking at the geometric forms he had been copying, that there was a syntax to them, a word he used naturally and without self-consciousness, meaning that they were not simply decorated but arranged according to a rule. He said it was the regularity that convinced him, that decorative art in any tradition he knew of had organic variation, because decoration follows feeling, but these forms were invariant, each repetition of each symbol identical to the others, in a way that suggested the form was the point, that the form was carrying meaning, that it was not free to vary because variation would change what it said. I looked at what he had copied. He was right about the regularity. Whether he was right about the meaning, I could not say. I should tell you here about one additional thing I noticed that second day in the plaza, something I did not mention to the others immediately, something I have thought about often since. The figure at the far end of the plaza was, as I said, seated and facing the entrance. What I had not examined carefully enough on the first day, because the light was poor and we had not been in the space long enough, was the floor directly in front of the figure. On the second day, with better light from the ceiling gap and more time, I could see that the floor directly before the figure was not fitted stone, like the rest of the plaza, but a different material entirely, a rectangular section perhaps 6 feet by 4, set flush with the surrounding stone, but composed of the same dark basalt as the tablet Luther had taken. And in this basalt section, the same glyph that covered the tablet was cut, larger, a single enormous instance of it, centered in the section, and around it a radiating arrangement of the smaller geometric forms from the corridor panels. It was a threshold. I understood that immediately, and without any need for extended analysis. It was a threshold, the specific material and the specific marking making clear that this was a demarcated crossing point. Between the entrance and the figure, that panel of basalt constituted a border, and the single large glyph at its center, which was identical in form to the ones covering Luther's tablet, was the marker. I stood at the edge of this threshold section, and I did not step onto it. I stood there for a long moment in the cold, in the pressurized cold that was worst here in the sealed central chamber, and I looked at the figure, and I want to tell you what I observed, with full acknowledgement that I may be wrong about how to interpret it, but full confidence about what I saw. The metallic veins in the dark stone of the figure were not all oriented the same way. I had noticed this the first day without registering its significance. On the second day, in better light, I could see that the veins in the lower portion of the figure, the legs, the folded hands, the base where it connected to its pedestal, ran in random directions, as veins do in natural stone. But in the upper portion of the figure, the chest, the neck, the face, the veins were oriented. They ran horizontally, parallel to each other, at the same height as my own eyes when I stood before it at full height. And the pattern of their orientation created, in the way that random grain in wood can create the illusion of a face, the impression of two eyes, horizontal, level, looking directly forward, looking directly at me. I stepped back from the threshold. I could not have told you precisely why, only that the instinct to not be standing at the edge of that marked border while looking at that face was suddenly very strong. I stepped back 3 paces and looked at the figure from there instead, and the impression of directed attention diminished but did not vanish. Luther had been around the back of the figure, and now came around the left side of it. And as he did, he stepped without hesitation onto the basalt threshold section, walked across it, and stopped 3 feet in front of the figure's face. He stood there for a moment. Then he looked at me over his shoulder and said he thought it was just a carving, and went back to examining the base. I said nothing. I was already thinking about the morning. I did not sleep well the second night. I want to tell you what woke me, specifically, because this is one of the points in the account where I am most careful to tell you only what I can attest to and nothing beyond it. I woke at what I estimated to be 2 in the morning, 3 hours before first light. The fire was lower than the first night, reduced to a thin bed of coals that gave no warmth at the distance of my bedroll. The air temperature had dropped overnight, as it does in October in that elevation, and my exposed face was cold in the ordinary way, the ambient cold, the cold of the season. My hands were not cold in the ordinary way. My hands were inside the bedroll, and they were cold in the pressurized way, the way I had felt at the base of the first flight of stairs. Specific, focused, a cold with mass, pressing against the skin from the inside of the gloves I had kept on for sleep. I lay still for a moment, registering this, and then I sat up. The camp was quiet. Thomas was asleep. Ord was asleep. Luther was asleep. But something about his position was wrong. He was flat on his back, which was not how he had lain down, and his right arm was outside the bedroll with his pack wedged underneath it, the pack that held the tablet. His arm was exposed to the ambient air from the shoulder to the wrist, and even in the near darkness I could see the vapor rising from his hand, the cloud of frozen breath that should have been coming from his face, but was instead rising from his open palm. I got up. I went to him and crouched beside him and held my own hand over his. The cold was coming from his hand, or more precisely, from what was beneath his hand, from the pack below his arm and whatever was inside it. I pressed the back of my hand down until it was perhaps 2 inches above the canvas of the pack, and the cold there was extraordinary. Not the 40 below zero cold of a mountain winter, not that dramatic, but a precise, contained cold, as though the pack held a block of ice, except that the pack also held a tablet of stone that had been at the same temperature as everything else when we packed it. I pulled Luther's arm back under his bedroll. He stirred but did not wake. I thought about taking the pack away from him. I thought carefully about whether I could do that without waking him, and whether waking him was worse than not taking it, and in the end, I did not take it. I went back to my bedroll and lay awake for most of what remained of the night, thinking about the threshold panel and the marker glyph and the tablet and what it meant that they were the same. By first light I had worked it out to my own satisfaction, and the conclusion was not comfortable. The glyph was a marking of ownership. Not metaphorical ownership in the way that a man marks his name on a tool or carves his initials into a claim post. A marking of ownership in the sense that a lock is ownership. This belongs to this place, and this place belongs to this. The tablet had been seated in the threshold of that structure, on the first level, at the top of the second flight of stairs, at a specific point in the sequence of the building, not on a wall for decoration, on a threshold, and it bore the same glyph as the central marker in the plaza before the figure. The tablet was part of the threshold. Removing it was not looting a decoration. Removing it was opening a lock. I do not know how to tell you what I believe was on the other side of that lock without sounding like a man who has lost his reason. I will try. I believe that what was in that mountain was not entirely stone. On the third morning, the gray was gone. I will tell you this plainly, because it deserves plainness. The mule had been staked to a pine with a 15-foot rope. The rope was still there, still tied to the pine, still in good condition. The halter was still there, still attached to the rope. The halter was not unbuckled or broken. The mule was not in it. The halter lay on the ground in the shape of the mule's head, as though the animal had simply ceased to occupy it, the way a shirt left on the ground holds the shape of the shoulders that were in it. There was no blood. There were no tracks. The ground was frost-hard but not frozen solid, and there had been enough mud at the staking point from the water the mule had spilled from his bucket the night before that tracks, any tracks, ought to have been visible. There were the grey zone tracks from the previous day, still there, pressed into the dried mud. There were no new tracks of any kind. Thomas looked at the halter for a long time. Then he looked at me. I said that I thought we needed to discuss the situation. We discussed it there, at the staking point, the four of us, and the discussion was the most important 20 minutes of that entire expedition and possibly of my professional life, because it was the point at which the story could have gone differently and did not. I laid out what I knew. The cold and its specific behavior, which I had tested and documented in my own mind if not on paper. The tablet and its relationship to the threshold glyph. The mule's disappearance from a sealed halter without tracks. I said that I believed these things were connected and that the connection pointed in a direction we needed to take seriously. I said that the tablet had been removed from a threshold in a structure that appeared to have been designed and maintained with deliberate purpose, and that I did not think we should be inside that structure without understanding that purpose better, and that I thought we should return the tablet to where it had been and leave the site. Ord listened to all of this and said nothing. Thomas listened and said he had been thinking similar things since the first morning, and that he was prepared to support whatever I decided. Luther listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when I was done he said that the mule had been taken by a mountain lion, or had simply broken free of the halter in the night, as mules occasionally did, and that the cold in the structure was consistent with a deep underground limestone environment, which this was not, and he knew it was not, but he said it anyway, and that the tablet was a piece of carved stone that was going to sit in his pack, and then in a buyer's cabinet in San Francisco, and that he was not putting it back. I said, "Luther, put it back." He said no. I want to tell you about the next 3 hours, because this is the part of the account that I have gone over most carefully in my memory, testing each detail, asking myself whether what I experienced was real, in the way I have described it, or whether the cold and the strangeness of the situation had affected my perceptions in ways I cannot now correctly distinguish from actual events. I am satisfied that what I describe below is accurate. I am aware that you may not be. I can only tell you what happened. We went down on the third morning because Luther went down, and because I would not leave him there alone. Thomas came with me. Ord came last, and he was not easy in his movements on the stairs. He had not said what he was thinking, but something in his face had been different since the previous afternoon, since the notebook and the geometric forms, and I noticed it and did not address it, because we were already on the stairs, and I needed to be present for what came next. The cold on the first descent that morning was worse than it had been on the previous 2 days. I want to be precise about this, because the progression matters. On the first day, the cold at the base of the first flight was notable but manageable, a sharp cold, breath fogging, hands aching through gloves. On the second day, the same location was colder, frost crystallizing on the wall near my exhaled breath, the cold feeling more pressurized, more intentional. On the third morning, the base of the first flight was cold enough that I could feel it in my chest with each breath in, a physical ache behind the sternum of the kind you feel when you breathe in extreme winter air, the kind that signals that prolonged exposure could do damage. My hands in their gloves were aching within the first 30 seconds. And the cold was not the same everywhere. In the sections of corridor where the ceiling had collapsed and the sky was partially visible, the cold reduced, noticeably and immediately. In the sealed sections, in the roofed passages, and the covered stairways, it was worst. And it was worst of all in the direction of the second level. When I turned toward the second flight and the plaza, the cold intensified against my face, even standing still, as though it were moving toward me from that direction, as though it had a direction. Luther noticed it too. I could see it in the way he had his head down and his collar up in a way he had not done on the previous mornings. He was not comfortable. He was pressing through discomfort, which was a thing Luther could do when his will was set. and his will was set on whatever was in that plaza. We reached the second level. The figure was exactly as we had left it. The plaza was as we had left it. The threshold panel of basalt with its central glyph was as we had left it. The column of light from the ceiling gap fell in the same place. But the quality of the light was different. On the first 2 days, the ceiling gap had admitted ordinary October daylight, the flat, gray-white diffuse light of an overcast mountain morning. On the third morning, the light from the gap was not that. It was the same gap, and outside it was the same overcast morning I had seen when I came down through it on my way to the staircase. But the column of light it cast in the plaza was, in the center of its column, not white, but faintly gold. A warm tinge that was not consistent with the diffuse cloud-filtered light that was producing it. I looked up through the gap at the sky, and the sky was ordinary overcast. I looked at the column again, and the gold was there. Not dramatic, not blinding, but present. The column of light fell directly on the figure. Thomas had stopped at the bottom of the second flight and was not coming further. I looked back at him, and he shook his head once. His face was entirely still. I have known Thomas Healy for 20 years since that trip, and in all of that time I have seen him afraid exactly twice. This was the first time. Luther crossed the plaza and stepped onto the basalt threshold section without breaking stride. He did not fall. Nothing happened to him. Not immediately. He stepped onto it and crossed to the other side of it and stood before the figure's face and looked up at it. His pack was on his back with the tablet in it. He was standing 3 feet from the figure's face with the tablet in his pack and the threshold beneath his boots, and nothing was happening, and I could hear him breathing from 20 feet away, the slow, deliberate breathing of a man who is managing himself. Then the cold changed. I will not tell you that the temperature dropped further, because that would not be accurate. What changed was not the temperature itself, but the distribution of it. The cold had been present throughout the sealed chamber, everywhere equally. Now it moved. It gathered, is the word that comes closest. It gathered itself from the edges of the plaza and concentrated toward the center, toward the threshold, toward Luther, and as it did, the walls at the margins of the plaza seemed to recede into a darkness that had not been there a moment before, and the column of light contracted, very slowly, by what I estimated as 3 or 4 feet in diameter, growing brighter at its center as it narrowed, the gold quality intensifying. Luther turned around. He was looking at me, not at the figure, and his face had changed. The expression of calculation that I associated with his assessment of valued things was gone. What replaced it was the face of a man who has realized that his understanding of the situation was wrong and is recalculating rapidly, and who does not like what the recalculation is producing. He looked at me, and at Thomas, and at Ord, behind me, and then he looked at the threshold under his feet. He took 1 step off it, back toward us. The cold hit him like a wall hitting a man. I saw it happen. His whole body took the impact of it. His head went back and he staggered, and the vapor from his mouth came out in a single enormous cloud and fell straight down without dispersing, like a liquid, pooling on the threshold surface, and then it was gone. He was upright, both feet now on the near side of the threshold, and he was shaking, a fine, violent shaking that was not the normal shiver of cold, but the deep muscular tremor of a body that has been struck. He said nothing. His hand went to his pack strap. I had been moving toward him as this happened. Not running. I am not sure I could have run in that cold, but moving, and I reached him and I took his arm, and I said we were going. I turned him toward the second flight stairs and I walked him up them, and he went, not resisting, which he had never done before and which told me more about the state of his thinking than anything he might have said. We were at the top of the second flight when I heard Ord behind me say something in a voice that was not his normal voice. I stopped and looked back. Ord had not followed us. He was standing at the edge of the plaza, at the top of the second flight, not on the threshold, but looking at the figure. His notebook was in his hand. He was looking at the figure, and the notebook was open in his hand, and he was very still, and I could see from 20 feet away that his pen was not moving, that he was not writing, that the stillness was not the stillness of a man concentrating on his work, but the stillness of a man who cannot move. I called his name. He turned, and the turn was slow and effortful, as though the air between him and me had acquired resistance. He came up the stairs. He came steadily, one step at a time, not hurrying, his face pointing forward, his notebook closed and at his side, and he did not look back into the plaza as he climbed. When he reached the top of the second flight and was level with me and Thomas and Luther, I asked if he was all right. He said he was. He said it quietly and without inflection, and I looked at his face, and his face was the face of a man who has understood something and is still deciding what to do with the understanding. We got to the surface. The surface air was, as I have said, 40-some degrees, normal for an October morning in that drainage. I stood in it and felt it as I had not felt it in 3 days, warm, actively warm by comparison, the warmth of ordinary air on ordinary skin. I breathed it and the breath did not fog, or fogged barely, the normal minimal vapor of a cold October morning, and the absence of that heavy falling vapor that had been constant below was as noticeable as the presence of sunlight after days of cloud. Luther sat down on a boulder at the entrance to the excavation. He sat there for a long time. Thomas went to the fire and built it up, and we all stood around it, and nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Ord said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "It wants the stone back." I looked at him. He was looking at the fire. I said, "How do you know that?" He said he did not know it in the way you know a fact. He said it was more like reading a sentence whose grammar you understand, but whose specific words are not in your language, and that the sense of the sentence was clear, even though the vocabulary was not. He said the forms on the walls were organized around a principle of return. That was the word he used, return. Not merely repetition, but a specific cyclical logic in which things taken from their place had to go back, and that the cold was getting worse in specific relationship to the presence of the tablet, and that he thought I had been right on the first morning, and he wished he had said so then. Luther said nothing. He had his arms around his knees on the boulder, and his jaw was tight. I said to him that I was going to ask him one more time, and that this was the last time I would ask, and that after this, I would not argue with him, but I would take my own action, and he could decide for himself what he did with that. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It's a cold rock in a cave, Callum." That was the last thing Luther Webb ever said to me that I believed was honestly his opinion. Every other thing he said that day, and afterward, was a man trying to convince himself, and we both knew it. We built the fire and boiled water and ate a cold breakfast and did not speak much, and then I stood up and looked at Thomas and said I was going back down. Thomas said he would come. Ord said he would come. Luther did not say anything. I will tell you about the 3 hours that followed with as much precision as I can maintain, because this is the center of it. This is the account I need you to have. I took my pack, which held our season's placer gold. We had been at the site for 3 weeks before the diversion work opened the staircase, and in those 3 weeks we had recovered color from the tributary drainage that had been better than anything I had found since the original gold rush in that region. The gold was in leather pouches, totaling something near 4 pounds troy, which at the prices of that year represented approximately $900. A good season's return for a 4-man outfit working a single drainage. That gold was in my pack. I had consolidated it there 2 days earlier in the ordinary course of managing the camp, not with any prescience about what I would be doing with it. I want you to understand that I did not decide this lightly. $900 was close to a year's wages for a working man in Montana Territory in 1871. For a placer outfit of 4, it represented the shared labor of 3 weeks in difficult country, and was the reason we had come at all. I had approximately $100 of personal savings, in addition to my share of the outfit's earnings, and those savings represented the whole of my financial reserve. I decided to bring the gold because of something I did not say to the others when I explained my plan, something I understood only partially myself, only in the way Ord had described understanding the wall carvings, by grammar rather than vocabulary. The structure was old. Whatever it was and whoever had made it, it was very old, and the things inside it, the figure, the threshold, the carved panels, the cold, the structure itself, they had been in their places for a long time, and everything in their arrangement suggested that remaining in their places was the point, was the purpose, was what the entire construction was designed to maintain. The gold was ours. It had come out of the ground of that drainage, and it was ours by the laws of the territory and the conventions of the placer trade. But we had come into a place that was not ours, and we had taken something from it, and we were asking to leave. I thought we should bring something in return. This is the part you will think is not rational. I cannot defend it as rational in the terms a rational man would use. I can only tell you that I stood at the top of those stairs on the third morning with 4 pounds of gold on my back, and a very clear sense that going down with empty hands would not be adequate, and that this sense was not superstition or fear, but something more like reading the grammar of a situation that was not in my language. We went down. The cold on the first level was the worst yet. I had expected it to be worse, and I had still underestimated it. Within 10 steps of crossing the temperature threshold at the base of the first flight, the cold was working through my clothing in a way that felt like pressure rather than penetration, a sustained muscular ache that went from the hands up the forearms and settled in the chest with each breath. I breathed slowly and deliberately, as a man breathes in genuine winter, and I counted my steps and kept moving. The first level corridor was darker than on the previous days. I do not know how to explain this, given that the ceiling gaps that admitted the external light were unchanged, but the light that came through them seemed to reach less far into the sealed sections, as though the darkness in the covered passages had deepened, acquired a thickness that reduced the penetration of the ambient light. The carved panels on the walls were visible but barely. The geometric forms present more as texture than as image, and the torch gutter channels along the walls, empty of any fuel for however many years they had been empty, seemed in that dimness more intentional and more pointed than they had on any previous descent. We passed through the first level and went down the second flight. The second level was, as I have said, the worst for cold in the enclosed sections between the roof gaps, and the sealed passage at the base of the second flight was fully enclosed for its first 40 feet before opening into the plaza. Those 40 feet, on the third morning, required deliberate will to traverse. I am not given to hyperbole about physical discomfort. I have been caught in mountain storms that dropped temperatures 40 degrees in 30 minutes. I have forded creeks in May, with ice still in them. The cold in that 40-foot passage on the third morning was harder than any of those, not because it was colder in absolute terms, but because of the quality of it. The weight of it, the way it settled on you rather than assaulted you, as though you were walking into water that was thickening around you, rather than through air that was blowing at you. Thomas was behind me, and I could hear his breathing. I did not turn around. I counted the paces. 40 feet at my stride was roughly 14 paces, and I counted them, and on the 14th pace, the sealed passage ended, and the plaza opened around me, and the column of light was there. It was not the same as the previous days. On the first 2 days, the column of light had been the flat gray of ordinary cloud-filtered daylight. On the third morning, standing at what I had observed as the temperature threshold of the chamber, it had been gold-tinged. Now, on this third afternoon, the column was not white or gold, but something between those and a deeper tone, a warm amber that had no meteorological explanation, given the flat, overcast sky I had seen when I came down through the gap an hour before. The column fell on the figure as before, but the figure itself, in that amber light, looked different. Not more alive, I will not use that word, but more present, more complete, as though the previous sightings of it had been partial and this was the full version. I walked to the edge of the threshold section. I took off my pack. I crouched down and opened it, and took out the 4 leather pouches of gold, one at a time, and set them on the basalt threshold panel, spaced evenly across its surface, the heavy small shapes of them sitting on top of the central glyph and the surrounding geometric forms. I was not thinking in clear sequential thoughts at that point. I was operating from something below thought, the same grammar without vocabulary understanding that order had described, placing the gold on the threshold because the threshold was the place for an exchange, because the grammar of the structure said that the threshold was where things came in and went out, and I had something to bring in. I straightened up. I looked at the figure. The ambient temperature in the chamber dropped further. I felt it on my face and in my chest, simultaneously. A sudden descent that was not gradual but immediate. A step change, the way the threshold boundary itself was a step change. My exhaled breath fell from my mouth to the floor in a solid stream, heavy enough to be directional, and it struck the basalt panel and spread across it the way water spreads, covering the carved surfaces with a thin condensate that frosted almost immediately. My hands were no longer aching. They had gone beyond aching to a deep numbness that was not painful, but was alarming in a functional way. I needed my hands to work. I looked at the figure and I said, as clearly and plainly as I could form the words through a jaw that was already stiff, "We are returning what we took. This is what we have to give with it." I do not know who I was talking to. I will not pretend certainty I do not have. I was a man standing in a stone structure of unknown age and origin, in a cold that had no physical explanation, talking to a carved figure that was 8 feet tall and watching me. Talking because the grammar of the situation said that acknowledgement was required, that a silent deposit of gold pouches on a threshold in a structure this deliberate was not adequate, that the moment required a spoken accounting. I turned around. Thomas was directly behind me, close enough that I nearly walked into him. He had heard every word. His face gave nothing away. He turned and we walked back to the second flight. We were at the base of the second flight, 4 paces from the bottom step, when I stopped. I had left the gold. I had not taken the tablet. The tablet was still in Luther's pack at the surface. I stood at the base of the second flight for a long moment that I can still feel precisely in my body, the cold pressing against me from every side, the frost-touched walls of the passage at the top of the stairs visible in the dimness, and I made the decision that I have made in memory every few months for 30 years since. I turned around and went back into the plaza. Thomas said my name behind me. I kept walking. I went back to the threshold. The gold pouches were where I had placed them, sitting on the carved basalt, frost-covered now. I stood at the edge of the threshold section and I said, to the figure, to the stone, to whatever was in that mountain, that the tablet was not in my possession, and that I was going back to get it, and that I was asking for time to do that. I am aware of how this reads. I am telling you what I said. Then I turned around and went up. Luther was where I had left him, sitting on the boulder outside the excavation. Thomas went straight to him and took his pack off his back without asking, and Luther let him. Thomas opened the pack and took out the basalt tablet, and he held it out to me, and I took it. The tablet was cold on its back, the smooth, uncarved side, cold in the specific way I had noticed when it was in Luther's pack, the contained, targeted cold of something actively drawing heat. But its carved face, the glyph-covered front, was warm. Not room temperature warm, but warm the way a stone is warm that has been sitting in sun, actively radiating warmth outward from the carved surface. I turned it over and held both sides in sequence and felt the difference precisely. One side drawing heat, one side radiating it. The whole object a directional instrument, measuring something I could not name. I did not think about it. I went back down with the tablet. I will not walk you through the descent a 4th time in detail. I will tell you that the cold on the 3rd descent of that morning was worse than the 3rd morning's 1st descent, and that it was the worst cold I have felt in my life. I will tell you that my hands had lost most functional sensation by the time I reached the plaza, and that the act of bending over and placing the tablet on the threshold among the gold pouches required a concentration of will that I have not matched before or since for a purely physical task. I placed it carved side up, aligned with the central glyph of the threshold panel, and as best I could in the poor light, I positioned it to match the orientation it had been in when Luther first removed it, which I was working from memory alone. I did not know whether the orientation mattered. I thought it probably did. I straightened up. The cold changed again. Not worse this time. Different. The pressure of it. The quality of weight I had been feeling for 3 days. The sense of it pressing in from all sides with a deliberateness that felt structural. That quality reduced. Not vanished, not released entirely, but reduced, the way a held breath is reduced when the lungs finally begin to give. The amber quality of the column of light overhead shifted, pulling back toward the flatter gold of the third morning's earlier light. I looked at the figure. I looked at it for as long as I could stand the cold, which was perhaps 30 seconds. The eyes, the horizontal veins that had read as eyes when the light was right, were in that moment very clearly oriented toward the threshold where I had placed the tablet and the gold, not toward me. The attention had moved. I left. I did not run up the stairs, because I could not have run in that cold, and in the state my hands and legs were in. I walked, quickly and with intention, and Thomas was with me the whole way, and we came out into the October air of the defile, and I put my hands in my armpits, and stood there breathing, until my chest stopped hurting. Ord was sitting at the fire. Luther was sitting on his boulder with his head down and his arms on his knees, and he did not look up when I came out. I sat down at the fire and put my hands as close to it as I could manage without burning them, and I stayed there for 20 minutes without talking. The feeling came back into my fingers by degrees, the burning ice sensation of returning circulation that is almost worse than the numbness, and I registered each part of my hands returning to function and said nothing. Then I told them we were packing up and going. Nobody argued. We packed the camp in less than an hour. Tools, bedrolls, personal kit, food. We loaded everything into the packs that the 4 of us had carried in, because we had no mule. Everything the Grey had carried, which had included, in addition to the assay-ready gold I had left in the plaza, a significant quantity of equipment, 2 months of preserved food, the tent canvas, and some personal possessions of Luther's that he valued, was gone with him. We divided what remained among 4 sets of shoulders, and we walked out. The walkout was 6 hours, 4 miles of high drainage to the trail junction, and then 2 miles down to the nearest settlement. We did not talk much. The trail was clear and the weather held, and there was nothing to manage beyond the weight and the distance, and I was grateful for both because they gave me something other than the mountain to focus on. At no point on the walk out did I hear anything from the direction we had come. No sound, no pursuit, no indication that anything had followed us down the defile. The cold, when I checked it deliberately, the October ambient cold of the trail, was entirely normal. My hands, once they had returned to full circulation at the fire, were fine. Whatever had been happening in that mountain had stayed in that mountain. Or at least, nothing followed us out. I say that last part because I want to be precise about what I know and what I am inferring. I know that we walked out unmolested. I do not know what happened in the plaza after I left, what the condition of the threshold was, whether the gold and the tablet remained where I placed them or were received in some way I could not observe. I do not know what the Grey experienced or where he went or how. I have no information about any of those questions, and I will not speculate about them in a document that is supposed to give you the truth. What I know is this: we left, and we were not stopped. We arrived at the settlement near dark. We bought food and paid for sleeping space in a stable, which was all we could afford given that our season's earnings were sitting in a stone chamber on the side of a mountain 4 miles away. We ate, and Thomas drank considerably more than he ate, and Ord wrote in his notebook for 2 hours by the stable lantern, and Luther sat against the stable wall and looked at nothing in particular. He never asked me what I had done with the gold. In the months of occasional contact after that autumn, whenever I encountered him in the territory, he never mentioned the gold or the tablet or the structure in any form. The subject was, for him, simply absent. I do not know what to make of that. I have left it in the account as a fact without interpretation. Ord's notebook. I want to tell you about the notebook because it bears on what I said at the start, about other men who might go looking. When I was loading the pack to leave the settlement the next morning, I found the notebook in the outside pocket of my kit. Not my own notebook, but Ord's, the one he had been writing in by the stable lantern. I did not know how it had come to be in my kit. I still do not know. I held it for a long moment and then put it in the inside pocket of my coat, and I have had it since, and it is the reason I am writing to you. The notebook contains 3 things. Ord's copies of the wall glyphs, precise and extensive, covering 11 pages in fine pencil. A series of written observations about the geometric structure of the forms, his analysis of the syntax he had described, careful and specific, and far beyond what I could have produced because he was thinking in a way I was not equipped to match at the time. And a final entry, written the night in the stable after we came down. A single paragraph that I will copy for you exactly as it reads. The forms describe a guardianship of something that pre-existed the structure. The structure was built around it, not to contain it, but to acknowledge it. The threshold marks not a door but a boundary of address, the place where one world speaks to another. The cold is the speech. What we trespassed was not a building, we trespassed a conversation that was still going on. C was right to go back. The stone needed to go back. I do not know about the gold, but I think he was right about that too. Do not come here. Do not tell anyone where this is. I have not included the coordinates in this notebook, and I will not. He had not. Ord was true to his word in that, at least. The notebook holds everything except where the structure is. I have never seen Ord again after the settlement. I have made several attempts to locate him over the years, through the usual channels available to a man looking for another man who did not leave a strong paper trail, and I have not found him. I cannot tell you what became of him. I can tell you what became of me. I left Montana Territory in the spring of 1872 and returned to Edinburgh in 1875, my health not equal to further seasons in the high country by that point. I worked in survey administration for the territorial government of Wyoming for 2 years, between Montana and my return, which gave me access to the official record of mining claims and territorial survey filings, and in those 2 years I watched carefully for any claim filed on the drainage where the structure was located, and none was filed. The location remained as it had been when we found it. Unknown, unrecorded, unclaimed. I have kept it that way. The account I am writing to you is the full truth of what happened, with every detail I can reliably attest to. What I am not including, what I have never included in any document or any conversation, is the location. You will not find it from this letter. I am asking you not to try. I am asking you for something more specific than that. There is a man in Edinburgh who has been making inquiries about pre-contact stone construction in the Montana Territory, specifically in the Bitterroot approaches, who contacted me last year through a mutual acquaintance at the university. He had come across a reference in a survey document to an anomalous geological feature in a high eastern drainage that he believed was consistent with dressed stone, and he wanted my professional opinion, given my survey background in the territory, of whether the reference was credible. I told him the survey reference was likely an error of notation, that high-elevation granite formations in that region were frequently mistaken for dressed stone by surveyors working quickly in poor light. He thanked me, and the conversation ended. But the conversation happened, which means the question is alive somewhere, and it will stay alive because these things do. If a man comes to you with this account, or with any version of it, or with any reference to the drainage or the structure, I need you to tell him one thing. that the survey reference was an error of notation, and that anyone who goes looking in that drainage will find nothing but high-elevation granite formations and cold water. I need you to say this without hesitation, and without the quality in your voice that tells a man you are hiding something. I need you to practice saying it until it sounds like a fact you have held a long time, because that is what it needs to sound like. I am also asking you to keep the notebook. Do not have it translated. Do not show it to the man from the university or to anyone with a professional interest in pre-contact material culture. Keep it, because it is all the record that exists of what Ord saw in that structure, and it would be wrong to destroy it entirely. But keep it the way you would keep a document that belongs to someone who has not given you permission to act on it. It is evidence of something. It should remain evidence. It should not become a map. There is one more thing I want to tell you, James, because this is the part that I have withheld from the account itself, and that belongs here at the end, between us. I went back to the mountain in 1873. Not to the drainage. I did not go back to the drainage. I went to the general area, to the trail junction 4 miles out, and I stopped there, and I stood on the trail looking up the defile in the direction of the structure, and I remained there for perhaps half an hour. I felt the cold from the trail junction. Not the ambient October cold, which I will say again I know and can distinguish. Not the elevation cold of the high drainage defile. A specific cold, localized to the air I was breathing while facing that direction, present in my lungs in the pressurized way, retreating when I turned my back to the mountain, and returning when I turned back. At 2 miles distance, I turned my back to the mountain and walked away from the trail junction, and I did not stop until I was back at the settlement, and there was a building between me and the direction of the defile. The cold stopped at the edge of the trail junction, exactly where I had entered it, and did not follow me down the main track. It stayed where it was. I booked passage east the following week. I am 63 years old, and I have not been cold in that way since the day I left that trail junction, and I am grateful for it, and I know it is conditional, because whatever lives in that mountain has stayed where it is, and has not been disturbed, and I intend that to remain true for as long as I am in a position to influence it. Burn this letter if you cannot keep the location secret. I mean this. If you cannot carry this knowledge without telling someone, burn the letter, and tell yourself that your brother wrote to you about a placer outfit in Montana that had a bad season and lost their mule and left empty-handed, which is, in the most literal terms, accurate. If you can carry it, keep it. The notebook is at the bottom of the cedar chest I shipped to you last spring, wrapped in oilcloth under the survey maps. Keep the notebook, keep the secret. Do not go to Montana looking for cold stone corridors in remote drainages. Do not tell the man from the university anything. There is something in that mountain that built a city around a conversation that was already old when the city was built, and it has been there since before anyone living has a record of it, and it is there still, and it was patient enough to wait in the dark and the cold for 3 days, while 4 men decided whether they had the wisdom to give back what they had taken, and it is patient enough still. And I will not be the one to tell you that this patience is inexhaustible, because I do not know that, but I will tell you that it has outlasted everything we know of in that part of the world, and that the cold at 2 miles in a sealed high drainage in October is not a thing you want to be the cause of. Go to your work, James. Let this stay where it is. Your brother, Callum.